Alright, hi everybody, we're starting, and here we are. We're on to the rest of the parts of the heart. And we have a lot of videos today, partially because the heart, it helps to see videos of everything move. And a lot in part because my kid is teething, and I'm not confident about my ability to say any words today. I'm like, oh, okay. He was up all night, feeling crabby. Which I feel bad, because it's got to be somewhat disconcerting to like suddenly have bones in your face. You're like, I wasn't expecting this. But seriously, like, it's been a long night. So, the heart. The heart's great. Remind me what the heart's doing? Pumping blood. Beautiful, you guys are on it. Okay, so it's pumping blood. Has anybody ever, say, worked food service? No? Yeah, okay. You're working food service, you're surrounded by food all your shift, but by the time you're done, you're really hungry? Yeah, and you're like, dad, like, I am surrounded in food, but like, I need food in me as well? Yeah, the heart has a similar deal. It's moving blood, it's moving all sorts of blood, but it's also moving oxygenated blood. But just because oxygenated blood gets to it on the inside, it still needs to have oxygenated blood get to its actual muscle, to the myocardium part. Are we okay with that? Let me make sure I'm recording here, because I don't want to do this again. Good, yeah. So, the cardiac circulation is going to be what's getting this done. You need to get blood to the muscle of the heart. The blood inside the ventricles isn't what's nourishing that. You have a whole series of arteries and veins that are going to, take blood to the heart, take blood away from the heart, the muscle part rather than the inside part. Okay if this is a concept? Cool. This is one of many reasons, this sets up what the problem is with heart attacks. And so we're going to watch it. Because it's cool. Too loud, sorry. Oh my goodness. Still too loud? Is that okay? Yeah. Online peeps, this is that YouTube video that's linked there.
Approximately 7 million people around the world die from heart attacks every year, and cardiovascular disease, which causes heart attacks and other problems like strokes, is the world's leading killer. So what causes a heart attack? Like all muscles, the heart needs oxygen, and during a heart attack, it can't get enough. Fatty deposits, or plaques, develop on the walls of our coronary arteries. Those are the vessels that supply oxygenated blood to the heart. These plaques grow as we age, sometimes getting chunky, hardened, or inflamed. Eventually, the plaques can turn into blockages. If one of the plaques ruptures or cracks, a blood clot will form around it in minutes, and a partially closed artery can become completely blocked. Blood flow is cut off to the cardiac muscle, and the oxygen-starved cells start to die within several minutes. This is a myocardial infarction, or heart attack. Things can rapidly deteriorate in the absence of treatment. The injured muscle may not be able to pump blood as well, and its rhythm might be thrown off. In the worst-case scenario, a heart attack can cause sudden death. And how do you know that someone is having a heart attack? The most common symptom is chest pain caused by the oxygen-deprived heart muscle. Patients describe it as crushing or vice-like. It can radiate to the left arm, jaw, back, or abdomen. But it's not always as sudden and dramatic as it is in the movies. Some people experience nausea or shortness of breath. Symptoms may be less prominent in women and the elderly. For them, weakness and tiredness may be the main signal. And surprisingly, in many people, especially those with diabetes, which affects the nerves that carry pain, a heart attack may be silent. If you think that someone might be having a heart attack, the most important thing is to respond quickly. If you have access to emergency medical services, call them. They're the fastest way to get to a hospital. Taking aspirin, which thins the blood, and nitroglycerin, which opens up the artery, can help keep the heart attack from getting worse. In the emergency room, doctors can diagnose a heart attack. They commonly use an electrocardiogram to measure the heart's electrical activity, and a blood test to assess heart muscle damage. The patient is then taken to a high-tech cardiac suite, where tests are done to locate the blockages. Cardiologists can reopen the blocked artery by inflating it with a balloon in a procedure called an angioplasty. Frequently, they also insert a metal or polymer stent that will hold the artery open. More extensive blockages might require coronary artery bypass surgery. Using a piece of vein or artery from another part of the body, heart surgeons can reroute blood flow around the blockage. These procedures reestablish circulation to the cardiac muscle, restoring heart function. Heart attack treatment is advancing, but prevention is vital. Genetics and lifestyle factors both affect your risk, and the good news is that you can change your lifestyle. Exercise, a healthy diet, and weight loss all lower the risk of heart attacks, whether you've had one before or not. Doctors recommend exercising a few times a week, doing both aerobic activity and strength training. A heart-healthy diet is low in sugar and saturated fats, which are both linked to heart disease. So what should you eat? Lots of fiber from vegetables, chicken and fish instead of red meat, whole grains, and nuts like walnuts and almonds all seem to be beneficial. A good diet and exercise plan can also keep your weight in a healthy range, which will lower your heart attack risk as well. And of course, medications can also help prevent heart attacks. Doctors often prescribe low-dose aspirin, for example, particularly for patients who've already had a heart attack and for those known to be at high risk. And drugs that help manage risk factors, like high blood pressure, cholesterol, and diabetes, will make heart attacks less likely too. Heart attacks may be common, but they don't have to be inevitable. A healthy diet, avoiding tobacco use, staying fit, and enjoying plenty of sleep and lots of laughter all go a long way in making sure your body's most important muscle keeps on beating.
So far, so good? It looks like you all maybe are comfortable with that. A lot of people actually think a heart attack is when, like, something inside the heart, like, blocks the flow of blood between, say, one of the atria and the ventricle. But that's not what's happening. It's something's blocking the heart itself, the muscle part, from getting the blood it needs, and then it can't do its job. We're cool with that? Great. Yeah, so here's our picture again. I had a lot of words to show you, but then I have a video that just traces the blood, because we looked at all the parts on Thursday, but to trace the blood through the heart, we had these circuits, and just as a reminder, it's a double circuit. You've got the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Both are happening. Both are very important, and we're gonna trace the blood through the heart. Lots of all these words are describing this. But it's more fun just to see it in action. I promise it's not only videos today, but it helps to see pictures.
The pathway of blood flows through the heart.
So cool.
Oxygen-poor blood from your body returns to the right atrium of the heart. Blood from your upper body returns through the superior vena cava. Blood from the lower body returns through the inferior vena cava. As the right atrium is filled with blood, it contracts, the tricuspid valve opens, and blood is pumped into the right ventricle of your heart. When the right ventricle is full, the tricuspid valve closes to prevent blood from flowing back into the atrium. The right ventricle contracts, pulmonary valve opens, and blood is pumped into the pulmonary artery and to your lungs. The pulmonary valve closes to prevent blood from flowing back into the ventricle. Oxygen-rich blood from the lungs returns to the left atrium of the heart, As the left atrium is filled with blood, it contracts, the mitral valve opens, and blood is pumped into the left ventricle of your heart. This occurs at the same time as the right atrium pumps blood into the right ventricle on the other side of the heart. As the left ventricle is full, the mitral valve closes, the aortic valve opens, the left ventricle contracts, and oxygen-rich blood is pumped into the aorta to reach all parts of your body. This happens at the same time as the right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary artery on the other side of the heart. The aortic valve quickly closes to prevent blood from flowing back to the heart. Meanwhile, the atria have filled with blood, and the cycle repeats itself.
Do you see how that works? It's pretty, in my opinion, it's fairly intuitive when you watch it. When, you know, it fills, comes in, comes out, comes in, comes out. But trying to describe it in words, there's a lot of words. You're like, okay, we've got this going, and they're all happening at the same time. People are comfortable with this, though? It's worth noting, a couple things worth noting. Let's go back to our picture. Well, let's go here. It's worth noting that the heart's pumping, right? It's pumping constantly. There's an equal amount pumped to the pulmonary circuit as there is to the systemic circuit. So like each squeeze, right, is going to pump some volume of blood, and you can pump that same volume to the pulmonary circuit, and you're going to pump that same volume to the systemic circuit. So every time you squeeze, you're moving a certain amount of blood. And those should be the same. This pulmonary circuit also, it's really short, which you're probably aware of, right? Like, the heart's right there. The lungs are, like, right there, right? It's not very far. That circulation here, yes, it's a pressurized system, but it's a fairly low pressure system. It really doesn't have tons and tons of pressure. Whereas the systemic circuit, the blood pressure coming off of the heart here is really high. It's maybe a little bit tricky to see here. It's probably easier to see in some other picture. That's maybe as good as we've got. Yeah, that works. You've got the right ventricle and the left ventricle. You can kind of see some differences there. If you're actually looking at the heart, that freaks me out. The left ventricle is way thicker. They're about, actually, like in a real heart, they're about 3 times thicker than the right ventricle walls. They've got to pump with more pressure. They've got both right and left ventricles are going to be pumping out the same volume of blood, but the left ventricle has to really, push. Yeah? So far, so good. This coronary circulation is why heart attacks again are a problem. It's its own weird little thing. It's the blood supply from the heart to itself, right? And the left ventricle, which is where there's a ton of muscle, right, where it's really thick, that's what needs the most of it, but the whole heart needs it. And we'll just look at the picture here. We've got, you see these coronary arteries? They're coming off the aorta, right? So this blood is coming from, so the left ventricle is just pumped into the aorta. Basically, as soon as it hits the aorta, it's coming back off onto the coronary arteries. So it's coming off there. Yeah, and it's happily supplying the heart with blood. The heart isn't that big, right? It's about the size of your fist. But it's going to routinely use about 20% of your blood. It just is very, very committed to having blood, and it's not that hard to get it because it's like right there. We're okay with that? The right and left coronary arteries branch slightly different places. For heart attacks, it's important sometimes to know which one's having a problem. But in general, they're just there supplying blood. You also have coronary veins. Right, you'll see them here. They're doing what veins do, right? And they're going to collect blood from the capillary beds of the heart muscle itself and return it to the right atrium, right? Just like regular venous return. Questions? Coronary circulation? Great. I feel weird with some of the terms, right? Because we've got blood flow of the heart, all that blood in there doing stuff, and then blood flow to the heart. Which are different things, but they're both basically this, trying to move blood around. All right. So there we have our heart. There are several problems that can happen. Lots of problems. We'll look at a couple of them. Have you ever heard of angina? We've talked about it. Somebody wanted, people who are nodding their heads. Just hurt.
I don't know.
But you've heard it? Yeah.
It's just like decreased oxygen to the heart.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it hurts. Often it causes chest pain. It's not straight up a heart attack. For some reason, blood delivery didn't happen. It describes a problem. It doesn't say what caused it. Same thing with heart attacks. Heart attacks officially are called myocardial infarctions. Myocardial meaning muscle of the heart, right? And that's when the heart muscle hasn't gotten blood for a while that it needs, and then you end up actually killing some of the muscle cells. They end up dying. And that's a problem, right? Because if heart muscle isn't able to do its job, it can make it hard for the heart to, function. Oh, sorry. This was like, I worked on this in like 3 different chunks. And I'm not sure, when I was putting this, I thought that this picture was relevant at this point. I'm not sure why, but there's a side view of the heart. And this is too close to the actual time we looked at it, but heart attack, what's it called? Which one? Yeah, we're okay with this last one, myocardial infarction. Great. Okay. The rest of today is all about getting the heart on its appropriate rhythm. All right? Anybody here in some sort of currently or in the past, some sort of musical group, band, choir? Sweet. Audition bands, choirs, just... Okay, if you've been in a non-audition band or choir, is there anybody in it who does not know how to keep a beat? Like, to save their life? Yeah. Okay, your face says yes. Tell us more.
That's pretty obvious when someone doesn't know, like, the timing.
Yeah.
Because it just throws everything off.
Yeah, okay, so it's not just them, too, is it, right? So if one person's, like, a little bit loud or a little bit soft, that's not such a big deal. But if their timing's off, it spreads, right? Yeah. But also, in happy news, if there's one person who's, like, spot on always, that helps the whole group too, right? Have you seen this? You're like, okay, well, I'm not going to listen to them. I'm going to listen to them because they've got it, right? The heart's busy trying to keep a beat in a very specific rhythm. And the challenging part is the heart doesn't just have a, like, on-off exactly. It has to do things in a series of orders. right? It can't just be like all of the heart squeeze at once, right? Because that wouldn't work because you've got blood needs to come in and blood needs to go out, right? So you can't just like have the whole heart crush down and then uncrush, right? That doesn't work. You need to have a pattern, which makes it harder to set this up. But it is truly impressive, the series of steps in the organization. Cardiac muscle is all sorts of special in that in some ways it's a lot like skeletal muscle, right? Help me out. Why is it like skeletal muscle? Yeah, it's striated, it's good, it's nice and stripy. Yeah, it's got a shape that's kind of skeletal muscle-ish, right? It's also like smooth muscle in that it does not care what you think. I mean, it cares what you think a little bit, but it is happy to do its job without conscious input. It has its own contraction that it just is gonna do. That contraction that it's just set up for itself to do is going to be influenced by intrinsic factors, things inside of it, and also external factors. So, thinking about things, exercising, being scared, drugs, a whole bunch of things are going to influence that rate. But even in the absence of that, the heart is going to hopefully just keep on chugging along. Yeah? You get excited. Okay. There's something called the intrinsic conduction system of the heart. It's going to be inside, and it's called conduction because it's moving electricity around. It's conducting electricity. It's inside. It's going to look a lot like action potentials. It's going to look a lot like action potentials, and we're going to watch how they go. Like action potentials, unless something goes truly terribly wrong, there's a distinct order. You're not going to have it bleed backwards. You're going to have it go one direction, and then reset and go one direction, go reset, go one direction. You don't suddenly, you never hear of people who suddenly start pumping their blood backwards. That would be so weird, but it doesn't, you don't, no. The valves are wrong too, but yeah. Okay. So, getting this all coordinated, there are two things setting this up. The first one that we're going to just gloss over, but it's really important, are things called gap junctions. There's one cardiac cell, another cardiac cell. They're next to each other. They're also physically in contact with the cytoplasm of each of those cells. So they've got basically little holes between them that lets them sense what one cell, the electricity of one cell is felt by the other cell. So this makes it really, really fast, and it makes it so that as one cell changes, its neighbors know what just happened. So they respond as well. Okay? So that's gap junctions. The big player that drives this, or helps drive this, is this intrinsic cardiac conduction. It's got a whole bunch of these cells that do not pump. They're not helping with the actual squeezy part of the heart. But what they're doing is they're sending signals, right? They don't need to pump, they just need to tell the heart how to pump. Yeah? You need to see a video. I have like tons of videos for this one because I'm very excited about what it looks like. Did I tell people I totally, a while ago, because of my YouTube browsing habits, got like end-of-life planning things, ads for me? Because I keep looking up like diseases and stuff, and they're like, have you considered putting your affairs in order? Well, okay, I guess I will, but sure. Anyways, here we are. This is going to talk a lot about external pacemakers. But external pacemakers are trying to copy what the heart should be doing normally. So here we are.
And defibrillators are devices that
Is that loud
apply
enough?
electric shocks to maintain the rhythm of the heart and, if necessary, restart it. As the technology improves and the list of treatable conditions grows, the number of devices being implanted is increasing steadily and now exceeds 500,000 a year. The heart is made up of 4 chambers, 2 atria and 2
And you
ventricles.
know all this stuff now.
On each side, the atrium is connected to the ventricle by a one-way valve. Blood is pumped as these chambers contract and relax in turn. The beating of a healthy heart is regulated by electrical impulses. The sequence begins as the atria fill with deoxygenated blood from the body on the right and oxygenated blood from the lungs on the left. An electrical signal from the sinoatrial node then causes the atria to contract, forcing blood into the ventricles. The electrical signal is then picked up by the atrioventricular node and directed into the Purkinje fibers in the ventricle walls, causing the ventricles to contract, and the blood is then pumped through the pulmonary valve on the right to the lungs and the aortic valve on the left to the rest of the body. These valves close and the
I'm going to pause that. I realize it's annoying to do this in the middle of the video. Do we all see, though, the idea of it needs to be symmetrical, right? If these close, you want them both to close at the same time. You don't want them to be off half a step. Same with the ventricles, right? You want them to contract basically at the same time, right? You don't want it to be contract, 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 contract. That just is very bad. Sorry.
starts. When the sinoatrial node fails to function correctly, an artificial pacemaker can be fitted to help regulate the heartbeat with small, evenly timed electric shocks. This involves implanting electrodes into one or more of the heart's chambers by inserting leads into a vein near the collarbone and implanting a device called the generator just under the skin. For more severe heart conditions, an implantable defibrillator, or ICD, can be used, which is also capable of sensing a stopped heart and delivering an electric shock powerful enough to restart it. For some conditions, an even more sophisticated device, called a CRT ICD, can be implanted. This uses a third lead inserted into the left ventricle to resynchronize the ventricles when necessary. However, all these leads can cause problems of their own. Patients with ICDs have a 20% chance of a lead failure within 10 years, and replacing leads can require open heart surgery in about 2% of cases. This has resulted in several efforts to develop new pacemakers that do not depend on leads inside the heart. One design, the subcutaneous ICD, places the lead just outside the heart under the patient's skin. And wireless designs are now being developed that may eventually do away with the need for leads altogether.
Right. Okay. So the heart's going to be sending, is going to be having its pacemaker situation happen, right? And it's from that pacemaker that it has, you can get an external one, right? But the heart's internal pacemaker sending signals to the rest of the heart to fire, right? But it's kind of tricky, and this is where I think it's really cute, for cells to tell time, right? Like they can, some cells can do it, but it's tricky for them to tell time, because if your cell, how do you do that? If you're a little pacemaker cell, how do you know when to fire next, right? Do you see the problem? Cells need to, these little pacemaker cells need to fire, 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 and they need to do this in the absence of outside stimulation. Outside stimulation can adjust it, but they need to just be able to just do this by themselves. So how do they count to themselves? Does that make sense? Yeah. Any guesses? Or do you just want to see it? But yeah, okay, you see the problem. Like, you've had this problem too, maybe, perhaps, if you're someplace where you don't have a clock, and it's dark, Or you're like in a grocery store and you didn't bring your phone. You're like, I have no idea. It could have been like 2 minutes, could have been 10 minutes. I have no idea how long I've been here. Right? Okay. The little pacemaker cells are going to do this. Basically, they're going to go through a series of events. And once they get done with that series of events, they know that it's been that amount of time. It's also what's going to send the signal. So the membrane potential of these little pacemaker buddies, they're not stable. So normal cells, when they have a resting membrane potential, the resting membrane potential, I'm sorry, I'm working on the whole saying words today. The resting membrane potential is usually held pretty much flat until something happens and changes it. Cardiac pacemaker cells, their resting membrane potential doesn't stay put. It changes. It changes through 3 parts, and we're going to look at them. So, we've got this little thing right here called the pacemaker potential. It's labeled here as 1. So at this point, there's, I'm hearing random sounds, but that's okay. There's sodium, okay, so, sorry. You have, potassium channels are closed, but there are some channels, and this is going to look backwards from how neurons did it. Sodium channels that took a minute to open are opening. So you've got sodium channels open. So because sodium channels are open, the cell gets less negative. So far, so good? Sodium channels open, the cell gets less negative. It hits threshold, like it would in action potential, except when this hits threshold, instead of, so this hits threshold and you let calcium channels open. So now you have calcium channels open and calcium is going to rush in really fast. Okay with this? The ideas are the same, but the ions playing the roles are slightly different. So far, so good? So you've had sodium channels that were slow, but they're letting sodium in. Sodium's trickling in, gets it positive enough to hit threshold, open calcium channels. Calcium pours in fast and goes way, and the cell gets positive. Yeah? Or gets less negative, is a better way to say that. Then you have, calcium channels inactivating. In neurons, we had seen sodium channels inactivate, but here calcium channels inactivate. So calcium can't keep coming in. And potassium channels got around to finally opening. They open and potassium pours out. We're okay with that? We have 3 things happening. We've got sodium. This just kind of letting a little bit of sodium just trickle in. Pretty much doesn't, it's not particularly interesting what's going on, but sure, sodium can come in. Sodium can come in, sodium can come in, it's going to hit threshold. Once it hits threshold, you're going to let calcium in. Calcium's going to come in. As calcium comes in, you're going to end up, opening potassium channels. Potassium's going to come out. Calcium channels inactivate, and you're back to where you started. So this is the resting membrane potential of cardiac pacemaker cells, but you'll notice it's never just flat. It's never just chilling, doing its own thing. Okay with that? Questions? I feel like since you've seen this with, or similar concept with neurons, you're like all over this idea now? Yeah? Cool. So it's time for another video. So that's the little cell's job. But they're going to send, they're going to send that, they're going to send the signals in a specific way, and we'll watch them.
The cardiac conduction system consists of the following.
Question, do you want this sped up a tiny bit? He's just so calm. Okay, let's listen to calm.
Components. The sinoatrial node, or SA node, located in the right atrium near the entrance of the superior vena cava. This is the natural pacemaker of the heart. It initiates all heartbeat and determines heart rate. Electrical impulses from the SA node spread throughout both atria and stimulate them to contract. The atrioventricular node, or AV node, located on the other side of the right atrium near the AV valve. The AV node serves as electrical gateway to the ventricles. It delays the passage of electrical impulses to the ventricles. This delay is to ensure that the atria have ejected all the blood into the ventricles before the ventricles contract. The AV node receives signals from the SA node and passes them onto the atrioventricular bundle, AV bundle, or bundle of His. This bundle is then divided into right and left bundle branches, which conduct the impulses toward the apex of the heart. The signals are then passed onto Purkinje fibers, turning upward and spreading throughout the ventricular myocardium. Electrical activities of the heart can be recorded in the form of electrocardiogram, ECG, or EKG. An ECG is a composite recording of all the action potentials produced by the nodes and the cells of the myocardium. Each wave or segment of the ECG corresponds to a certain event of the cardiac electrical cycle. When the atria are full of blood, the SA node fires. Electrical signals spread throughout the atria and cause them to depolarize. This is represented by the P wave on the ECG. Atrial contraction, or atrial systole, starts about 100 milliseconds after the P wave begins. The PQ segment represents the time the signals travel from the SA node to the AV node. The QRS complex marks the firing of the AV node and represents ventricular depolarization. Q wave corresponds to depolarization of the interventricular septum. R wave is produced by depolarization of the main mass of the ventricles. S wave represents the last phase of ventricular depolarization at the base of the heart. Atrial repolarization also occurs during this time, but the signal is obscured by the large QRS complex. The ST segment reflects the plateau in the myocardial action potential. This is when the ventricles contract and pump blood. The T wave represents ventricular repolarization immediately before ventricular relaxation, or ventricular diastole. The cycle repeats itself with every heartbeat.
Okay, don't worry about memorizing which one's the Q portion or the S portion. Your book goes into a lot of detail, but the idea that you're looking at signals in different places in the heart, right? And that's why when someone who does this is looking at an EKG, they can see like, oh, that there where it should be, that like R peak, right? That's not looking like what it should be. And they know what's going on because each thing has a different signature, right? But I'll direct this. There we go. That was the picture I was looking for. For our purposes right here, we're at this point. We've got up there at the SA node, we have our little pacemaker cells, right? They're there and they fire, they go through a cycle and they fire, and they go through a cycle and they fire, right? They're sending that pacemaker signal. that pacemaker signal, I realize the video said this, but I just feel compelled to yap about it. It's going to send a signal to both of the atria, right, and say contract, right, go. And that signal is also going from the SA node to the AD node, but there's a built-in delay. So the SA node says go to everything, but there's a pause between that when that go message hits the atrium and when that go signal hits the AD node, which is really good because then the atria can respond, and a fraction of a second later, the ventricles can respond. Do you see that? Because then you empty the receiving chambers, you then have your pumping chambers full, you empty your pumping chambers, you then can just keep having the cycle continue. Okay, we're doing actually okay on time, I think. I've said this every single class, and I've never been right, but this time, maybe. Yeah. Left to its own devices, the intrinsic conduction system is about 75 beats per minute, just in general. Yeah. And this is gonna only go in one direction. It's going to force this depolarization from the top to the bottom, basically, from the atria to the ventricles. And yeah, we saw that. Okay. If something goes wrong here with the intrinsic conduction system, bad things happen, right? Arrhythmias are when there's an irregular heart rhythm. It's just not, the timing's off. This is going to end up meaning that the atrial and ventricular contractions aren't timed right. And that is a problem. You've heard of fibrillation, right? You've probably heard defibrillators more. What they're doing. So, Hollywood has a lot to answer for with medical ideas in general. In movies, when you see someone use a defibrillator, what you see is like, I don't know what movies you watch, but for some reason they're always already on like an EKG, and you're watching the beep, 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 and it goes flat, right? And then they like get defibrillated, beep, and it comes back up. That's not what it really looks like. Fibrillation doesn't mean that the heart has like stopped doing anything. It means that the heart has gotten messed up in its pacing, and it's going to have really fast but not very coordinated contractions. You'll see stuff like this. The heart is trying. The heart is very much trying to contract, but it's not coordinated appropriately. So all these different cells are kind of doing their own thing, and they're talking to their neighbors, but they're not coordinated like how they're supposed to be. So defibrillation, so if someone's in fibrillation, right, this portion, defibrillation is like, you know what? We're just gonna hard stop that. You know how like if your computer's being weird and you just like unplug it and plug it back in, right? Which from the computer's point of view is the same thing as like hitting on the head with a brick. It's like, ah, right? Defibrillation, the heart's all over the place, and maybe the SA node is actually trying to set the signal, the pacing right, but somewhere along the line something got messed up. And so there might be pacemaker signals, sending signals, the own little autorhythmic cells are doing their own thing, and everything's off kilter. So what you do is you just give a hard zap, and the defibrillator does that. Which just be like, you know what, knock it off. All right, SA node, take it away. And they can start back up. We okay with this? Do you want to see a brief public service announcement on how to use a defibrillator? Cool. This one is from the UK, so they suggest calling 999, but we call 911 because You're not in the United Kingdom.
This is a defibrillator. It can save someone's life, but only if
Lana?
you use it. A defibrillator is an easy-to-use device. You don't need any training to use it, because it will tell you exactly what to do. Shock advised. Its job is to shock someone's heart back into a normal rhythm during cardiac arrest. However, it will only instruct you to deliver a shock if this is needed. If you find someone unconscious, unresponsive and not breathing, or not breathing normally, they're in cardiac arrest. It's important to act immediately because their heart is no longer pumping blood to their brain and around the body. The first thing to do is call 999 and start CPR. The emergency operator will talk you through what to do and tell you where the nearest defibrillator can be found. If there's someone else around, ask them to go and get it. Defibrillators are normally located in workplaces and public spaces like airports, shopping centres, community centres and train stations. They may be labelled PAD, Public Access Defibrillator, or AED, Automated External Defibrillator, and anyone can use them in an emergency. The defibrillator will assess their heart rhythm and will only tell you to shock them if they need it. Shock advised. So you can't do any harm by using one. If a shock is needed, this will try and reset the electrical system in their heart to get it beating normally again. When used with CPR, defibrillators give the best chance of survival. So, when you witness someone in cardiac arrest, take action, start CPR, and find a defibrillator as soon as possible. For more information on defibrillators, visit bhf.org.uk/defibs.
So we're okay with that? Just in today's lab, there's one question about the respiratory part of CPR. But for CPR, what you're trying to do is you're pushing on somebody's chest. So when you're doing CPR, what are you doing when you're pushing on somebody's chest? What are you trying to have happen? Yeah, you're just pushing the blood forward. You're like, your heart is doing a terrible job. I'm going to do it, right? And you all heard, like, the beats you're supposed to do it to. You heard this? Depending on if you have, like, a crabby CPR trainer or a cheerful one, the cheerful ones have you do it to staying alive, and the crabby ones have it to another one bites the dust. You're like, oh, okay, well, Anyways, you try and push it. Defibrillators aren't trying to push blood. They're trying to get the heart back to, like, being in its own rhythm. Yeah? So far, so good? Alright, so there are other problems that happen too, and they can be different levels of severity. Have you ever, or heard of it, you don't need to tell me about this, but maybe had too much caffeine in your system, right? And you hear like a thud as your heart contracts? Does anybody know what I'm talking about here? Okay, it's not recommended. But that's a mild form of having the pacing be slightly off in the heart. I think I actually put a slide. Yes, okay. If the SA node isn't doing its job quite right, you can end up having abnormal pacing take over. And since there are a whole bunch of these autorhythmic cells, it can be different things that take over. If the AV node takes over, it sets its own rhythm, which it totally can do. It's got the capabilities to do this. And it is slower. And what happens is you can end up with things like what happens with excess caffeine, where you let the heart fill longer, so you get more blood than normal, and then it comes out, you hear the thud, because you're pushing more blood than normal. If the AV node, right, isn't working, it's called a heart block. So instead of listening to the pacemaker of the heart as a whole, the the ventricles are just going to do their own rhythm, which is almost always too slow to actually keep things flowing properly. This is what a pacemaker is trying to solve. It's saying, all right, since you're obviously not listening to the signal coming through the AV node, we're going to give you your own. Yeah? Okay. Your book, it's a good book. I do really like your book. I have a couple concerns with your book. I have a couple concerns when it gets to the reproductive system, actually, with your book. And, yeah, but in general, I really like your book. Your book really wants you to care very deeply about every single thing the heart does. I've kind of contracted it here a little bit because we have other things to talk about. But there are some terms you just need to know just because you need to know them. A whole heartbeat from when it starts to when it ends, the whole cycle, it's called a cardiac cycle. All right, you have one complete loop, basically. There are two terms in this, and you'll hear them in blood pressure. There's systole and diastole. Systole is the contraction part, right? It's characterized by like high pressure, right? Diastole is the relaxation part. When you get your, have you ever gotten your blood pressure taken? And you're given two numbers? You're like, wait a second. Should my blood pressure be like one number, like, you know, you take air pressure on a tire? You're like, yep, it's this number. Those two numbers are, they're saying, okay, what's the number, and you'll notice one number's higher than the other, right? They're saying, what's the blood pressure during systole, when things have just contracted, right? And what's the blood pressure when the heart's relaxed, right? So you have two different pressures there. Okay, so cardiac cycle, it's a little bit faster than a second, so you end up with just a little bit over 60, you end up like 75, typically, beats per minute. And so diastole, right, you've got the ventricles are filling, the atria are contracting. Systole, the ventricles are contracting, right? And then you start back over. Yeah. Yeah. Fine. Okay, sorry, I was getting excited, I was going to skip stuff, I won't skip stuff. We've got these three phases here. Mentally, diastole. Your blood, well, let's look at here. Your blood pressure is really low. Blood's coming in. Yeah, the atria contract, force blood there into ventricles. Great. You then have what's called the ventricular stroke. Blood pressure is going to rise here. It's going to rise because you have the same amount of blood as you did just a second ago, but you're going to make the space smaller, right? So the pressure goes up. You'll hear the atrioventricular valves close. If you're listening really carefully, do you guys get to hear it in lab, listen to the heartbeat? Yeah, you hear that like lub sound? That's what you hear. You're hearing those valves close. Lub. The semilunar valves open up because blood's pushing against them and the valves open that way. And the blood then leading through the pulmonary trunk, right, to go to the lungs, or through the aorta to go to the body system. And at this point, the atria, it's not shown here, but well, I guess it's sort of shown here. The atria are relaxed and they're starting to fill with blood again. Then you start early diastole. At the end of ventricular systole, for a brief moment, it's not very fast, it's not very long, but for a brief moment, all four valves are closed at the same time. And that's the you'll hear the dub sound. Everything's closed for a brief second. The idea is you don't get blood leaking backwards anywhere. Blood leaves, everything's closed, it's going one direction. and then your cycle will start back over. The pressure in the heart drops, right? So right here it's really, really high. Pressure drops, the atria fill up, and yeah, you're good to go. Questions with that? We're okay with that? Yeah? Cool. Great. Lots of things. Yeah, there we go. We're here. When people hear heart murmurs, the problem is typically you're hearing the valves have some problems with things not closing, and the pump isn't working as efficiently. Okay. So many abbreviations. Cardiac output is measuring how much blood each ventricle squeezes out in a minute, right? How could you make this number bigger? So if you have some cardiac output, how much blood the heart's pumping out, how could you make that more? Yeah, right? So if you had more heartbeats but kept the same amount of volume, you'd raise the cardiac output, right? And you've done this before, right? When you're like exercising or something, your heart rate goes up, right? Any other way to do that? Yeah, if you raise the amount of blood you're moving, you can get the same thing done. Do you see that? Either way, you can get more going. So you've got cardiac output, which is the amount pumped by each ventricle of the heart in a minute. You've got stroke volume, which is the every time I have a beat, how much am I moving? Typically, it's about 70 milliliters, but that's variable depending on how big you are, how efficient your heart is, how much you've exercised. A bunch of different things can affect that, but you're thinking about 70 milliliters. And your heart rate, typically, super just generally, it's about that 75 beats per minute, but that's incredibly adjustable. And here's some math, just briefly. Your cardiac output, your heart rate times your stroke volume, right? So if you're doing 60 beats per minute, this is going to be higher than if this is, lower than if this is 75 beats per minute, right? But the stroke volume, as that changes, is also going to change cardiac output, right? So typically, if you're just assuming an average person, average size, average heart rate, you're getting more than 5 liters of blood pushed out per minute, which is a lot of blood, just for the record. Have you ever felt your heart go faster or slower? Yeah. When's your heart, not counting injury disease, when has your heart been pretty chill about things? Yeah, you're just resting, sorry, I don't know who said it, but, oh, hi, sorry, I can't read people's, yeah, you're just kind of chilling, your heart's not in a big rush, it's just go on the wall, right? Cool. Anything else? That's usually the big one. What's going to make your heart beat faster? Stress, right? Yeah, that can be all sorts of stress, right? We're going to look at it in a sec. Okay, so the heart rate is going to get modified. It's doing its own thing with its intrinsic conduction system, but it's going to pay attention to the nervous system. It's the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is going to try to boss it around and not be able to entirely, but at least try. Some hormones and ions are also going to play a role here, and certain physical factors are also going to be important. Sorry, I get excited. If for whatever reason, like the heart's weak, or for some reason the heart can't pump a lot out each pump, right? So somebody's lost some blood, so there's just not, so every time it pumps, there's just not that much that's moving, or the heart's been damaged, maybe there's been scarring, and it's not very good at squeezing a lot. Most, a lot of medicines used to treat that just jack up the heart rate. They're like, well, it can't really help your stroke volume, but we can make your heart pump more. You okay with that idea? Yeah. So you're going to regulate it mostly through the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, norepinephrine, which, I again have no idea what movies you see, but have you ever seen people like, with epinephrine shot to like restart a heart? Yeah. Norepinephrine increases the heart rate. It will increase the heart rate. It will absolutely increase the heart rate. It'll also increase the squeeziness, right? So the heart's better able at squeezing. This is fantastic if it's been a problem. It's a bad deal if it hasn't been a problem. You don't suddenly want to just like stab yourself with norepinephrine. Don't do that. But if you need it, it's helpful. The parasympathetic nervous system can do the other thing. It can dump acetylcholine onto it, which is going to slow down the heart rate. This is worth mentioning. In muscle cells, in skeletal muscle, acetylcholine acts excitatory, right? It's going to encourage skeletal muscles to contract, right? So you're going to send acetylcholine across the neuromuscular junction, and you're going to open channels, you can let ions flow in, right, the whole bit. Acetylcholine in the heart is inhibitory. Acetylcholine showing up makes it so that potassium channels get open, and it slows the heart rate down. All right? It doesn't actually do anything on like the squeeziness, but norepinephrine does. So far, so good. So the autonomic nervous system can crank up the heart rate and can dial it back down. You know how left its own devices the heart has a rate of about 75 beats per minute? That's left its own devices, but having the parasympathetic nervous system talk to it. So the parasympathetic nervous system, yes, lets its heart do its own thing, but kind of permanently has like the brakes on a little bit. If you cut the parasympathetic influence to the heart ramps up. It goes to about 100 beats per minute. So basically, the parasympathetic nervous system, yes, isn't setting the beat of the heart, but it's just generally a calming influence. But as soon as you pull that calming influence off, you'll raise your heart rate up. Epinephrine and norepinephrine both are gonna jack up heart rate. Roxine, this one's a fairly common drug, is gonna increase heart rate as well. Ions, people don't mess around with for like treating. Well, these aren't given as medicines typically, but if calcium and potassium levels get shot, it messes up the heart deeply, deeply, deeply. Right? You've got to keep the ion balances right, otherwise you can't have normal function happen. You okay with that? That's why, lots of problems that cause ion imbalances in the blood are dangerous, not because so you have some potassium there, so you have some calcium there. It's your heart isn't going to know how to handle this, and it's going to get off whack. Yeah? It's one of the reasons why, bones, they're this reservoir of calcium. Your heart desperately needs calcium levels to be in the normal range, and your bones are completely fine to just basically become sponge and just dump all their calcium out if it means keeping the heart going. Like that trade-off will totally be made. But yeah, so yes, hormones and ions are gonna regulate this. The sympathetic nervous system activity is gonna be huge. And I actually have a chart that does all sorts of things. So many things going on. You've got cardiac output. This is, I think, the last slide. No, it's not. Huh. Fine, we're not gonna finish everything. That's okay. I talk too much, I know. Okay. Lots of things can increase heart rate, decrease heart rate, right? You're gonna have exercise, which is going to be able to increase your stroke volume if you do it enough. If you lose a bunch of blood, right? Okay, so if you exercise, you're increasing how much blood coming back, you're going to be able to increase your stroke volume. If you lose a bunch of blood, you're going to decrease the blood coming back, you're not going to have as much to pump out, right? Low blood pressure is going to act on the sympathetic nervous system and be like, hey, you should pump more, I don't have enough blood, speed it up. High blood pressure encourages the heart to chill a little bit because, like, we have plenty, slow it down. Stress typically, so like, even good kind of stress, like feeling in love or being super excited, is going to increase your heart rate because your body assumes you need more blood to everywhere. But yeah, overall, tons of ways to act on this. How are we on time? In 2 minutes. Hypocalcemia depresses heart. Hypercalcemia, so not enough calcium depresses the heart. Too much calcium increases heart rate. Yeah, potassium, we don't care about potassium right now. The younger you are, the faster your heart rate, almost always. Fetuses have wicked fast heart rates. Like, 140 is not a problem. Just like, phew, it sounds like when you listen to it, it just sounds almost like a blur. Women typically have faster heartbeats than men, and this holds true even if the heart from a female has been transplanted into a male or male into a female. The heart just holds its own rhythm. Yeah. Anyways. And heart rate increases with body temperature too. If your heart rate's really, really fast, it's called tachycardia. If it's really slow, it's called bradycardia. And that's all we're going through. If you want to watch more YouTube videos, there's one about congestive heart failure. And congestive heart failure is bad for you. It just means that the cardiac output is too slow to meet the body's demands. We're good? Okay, so we officially got done in time by skipping congestive heart failure. Any concerns?